The morning I wired $274,000 to pay off my parents' house, I was sitting alone at a folding table in my apartment, wearing the same hoodie I had worn the night before, eating cold rice from a container I had forgot to heat up. There was no celebration. There was no one calling to say well done. There was just the confirmation number on my screen, a number I had worked 19 years to be able to type. I sat there for a long time looking at it. I told myself the feeling would come later, the warmth, the pride, the moment where everything I gave up finally made sense. I drove 4 hours to my parents' house with a folder of documents, a bottle of sparkling water I had bought to make the moment feel special, and the quiet hope that maybe just this once I would walk through that door and be seen for what I had actually done. When I pulled up to the driveway, the locks had already been changed. My key didn't fit. And my brother was standing in the window, watching me stand there on the porch with my folder and my bottle of sparkling water, not moving to open the door. Before this story goes any further, I want to ask you something. If you had spent 19 years quietly carrying a family's financial weight, never asking for applause, never demanding credit, and then the moment you arrived to see what your sacrifice had built, someone had locked the door in your face, what would you do next? Would you knock again? Would you call? Would you walk away? Stay with Ackles, because what happens next is not something she planned for, and it is not something you will see coming either. My name is Ackles. I am 38 years old. I work in logistics management for a regional freight company in a mid-sized city that most people have never heard of unless they have driven through it on the way to somewhere else. I have a small apartment with good light in the mornings, a cat named Ferris who hates everyone except me, and a savings account that took most of my adult life to build into something real. I do not say any of this to sound impressive. I say it because for a very long time, none of it felt like it belonged to me. Most of what I built for other people. And for most of my adult life, those other people acted like that was simply the arrangement, like I was a resource that renewed itself and never needed anything in return. I need to tell you about the house first, because the house is where everything starts and where everything finally ended. My parents bought a modest 2-story home in a suburb of a mid-sized southern city when I was 9 years old and my brother Darren was 6. My father, Gerald, worked at a manufacturing plant. My mother, Renata, worked part-time at a school cafeteria and spent the rest of her time managing the house, managing Darren, and occasionally managing me when I needed it, though I rarely did. I was the older one. I was the one who figured things out quietly. I was the one who set the alarm, packed my own lunch, and walked myself to the bus stop from the time I was 10. Not because my parents were absent exactly, but because I learned early that the house operated on a certain understanding. Gerald handled the big decisions and the checkbook. Renata handled the emotional temperature of every room. And Darren was the one who needed the most attention, the most patience, the most protection. I do not say this with bitterness, at least not yet. I say it because it is the truth, and the truth is the only place this story makes any sense. By the time I turned 19, the house was in trouble. Gerald had been laid off when the plant restructured, and the family had been quietly falling behind on the mortgage for about 8 months. I had just started community college on a partial scholarship, working 20 hours a week at a copy center to cover the rest. When I found out about the mortgage, I did not yell, I did not panic. I sat at the kitchen table with my mother and I looked at the numbers and I said, "Tell me what is missing every month and I will figure out how to help cover it." Renata cried. She said I should not have to. I said someone had to, and I was the one who was here. I started sending home $200 a month from my copy center earnings. It did not sound like much, but on what I made it was close to half of everything. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself Gerald would find something soon and the situation would stabilize and I would be back to saving for myself within a year. I was 19. I believed a lot of things at 19 that turned out to be much more complicated. Gerald did find work again, eventually. But the work was lower paying and the mortgage had accumulated late fees and the house needed repairs, and there was always something. There was always a reason that the 200 became 250, that the 250 became 400, that the 400 became the quiet assumption that Ackles would help. And I kept helping. I kept telling myself the situation was temporary. I kept showing up. By the time I was 24, I was working full-time in a junior logistics coordinator position, going to night school for my certification, and still sending money home every month. I had moved out by then, but I had not really left. The financial tether kept me connected in a way that made moving feel more like a change of address than a real departure. I would call home on Sundays and Gerald would give me a quick update on the house, and Renata would ask how I was eating, and then the conversation would get around to the numbers. And I would confirm what I was sending that month. And then we would say goodbye and I would sit in my apartment and feel a very specific kind of tired that is hard to describe to anyone who has not felt it. Here is what I noticed but did not speak about for a long time. Darren was never asked to send money. Darren was never asked to sacrifice his plans. Darren was never pulled aside and told that someone had to be the one to help, and it might as well be him. Darren was the younger one. Darren had struggled in school. Darren had gone through some rough years in his early 20s that the family spoke about in careful, sympathetic language that communicated clearly without saying it outright that Darren needed to be protected from pressure while Ackles could handle anything. I want to be honest about something. Darren was not a monster at this point. He was just someone the family had built a different set of expectations around. He was someone who took what was offered without asking whether offering it was fair. He did not ask why Ackles was carrying this. He did not call me and say that does not seem right. He went to a state college on student loans that Gerald and Renata co-signed, graduated in 6 years instead of 4, moved back into the family house for 3 years after that, and spent a lot of that time figuring himself out. Which was fine. People figure themselves out, but no one ever seemed to notice that I had not been given the same runway. By the time I was 27, I had my full logistics certification, a mid-level management role, and a monthly contribution to my parents' house that had become deeply embedded in the family's financial structure. Gerald's health had started to decline by then. He had developed a chronic joint condition that limited his mobility and eventually pushed him into early retirement. The plant offered him a modest pension, which helped, but not enough to cover the mortgage alone. Renata worked as much as she could, but her hours had always been limited, so the house ran in large part on what I sent. I made a decision around that time that I have thought about many times since. I decided that instead of just sending monthly contributions indefinitely, I was going to build towards something concrete. I was going to pay off the house entirely. I had been doing the math for years in a quiet corner of my mind, the way some people plan vacations or weddings or business ventures. The outstanding balance on the mortgage at that point was somewhere around $310,000, factoring in the remaining principal and accumulated interest. I set a timeline. I told myself that by the time I was 40 or close to it, I would send my parents the final payment and the house would be theirs, free and clear. No more monthly burden. No more anxiety about what happens if Gerald's pension comes in short 1 month. No more holding their breath. I told no one this plan, not Renata, not Gerald, not Darren. I simply kept working and kept saving and kept adjusting my own life to make room for this goal. I did not buy a house of my own, though I could have by that point. I drove cars until they stopped running reliably instead of upgrading. I took fewer vacations. I cooked at home more than I wanted to. Every line on my personal budget that could be trimmed was trimmed. And the savings column grew slowly, patiently, the way a tree grows if you just leave it alone and keep watering it. I want to be clear about something. I was not miserable during these years. I had work I found genuinely satisfying. I had a small circle of close friends. I had Ferris, who came into my life when he was a tiny gray kitten someone left in a box near my building and who has been my most consistent companion since. I had a life, but the shape of that life had been drawn around a promise I had made to myself about a family that did not always make it easy to keep that promise. Darren moved out of my parents' house around the time he was 30. He had gotten a job in digital marketing, which he was good at in a scattered, energetic way. He had some natural talent for it, and he found a company that tolerated his particular brand of enthusiasm and eventually promoted him into an account manager role. He moved into an apartment with a friend, then got his own place a couple of years later. He started visiting my parents less, which was something I noticed, but which Gerald and Renata mostly absorbed without comment. He would call on birthdays and holidays. He would show up at Thanksgiving and sometimes Christmas. He was present in the way a person is present when they have not been asked to carry anything, and so their absence does not cost anyone anything practical. The dynamic in our family had always been quiet in this way. Gerald was not an expressive man. Renata was warm, but she managed warmth in careful doses that kept the peace more than they told the truth. Nobody sat down and said out loud, "We rely on Ackles too much and we should make sure she knows we see it." Nobody said, "Maybe we should think about how we talk about Darren versus how we talk about Ackles." These things were just the atmosphere of the family. You breathed them in. You did not name them because naming them would require admitting something that everyone had quietly agreed not to admit. There was one Sunday, I remember it clearly, when I was 31. I had driven up for my mother's birthday weekend. It was a small gathering at the house, just the 4 of us plus 2 of my mother's sisters who drove in from a few hours away. I brought flowers and a gift and a handmade card because I had learned early that making things myself meant something to my mother in a way that bought things did not always capture. Darren brought a bakery cake and a gift card. When my mother opened Darren's gift card at the table, she lit up in a way that made the room laugh. She said, "Oh, Darren, you are always so thoughtful." And then she turned to me and said, "And Ackles, these flowers are so beautiful, you are always so practical." I smiled. I laughed a little with everyone else. But on the drive home that night, I kept hearing that word, practical, Like what I offered was reliable and useful and warm in the way a good coat is warm, functional, and necessary, and not the thing you reach for when you want to feel loved. I kept sending the money anyway. That is the thing about building towards something. Once you are far enough in, the goal becomes its own kind of purpose. I had spent enough years working toward paying off that house that abandoning the plan would have felt like abandoning a version of myself that had sacrificed too much to quit, so I kept going. The turning point in how I understood the family dynamic did not come from a single explosion. It came from a series of small things that stacked up over the course of about 2 years, starting when I was 35. The first thing was a phone call from my mother on a Thursday evening. She was calling to tell me that Darren had offered to help fix the back porch. The wood on the back porch had been rotting slowly for about 3 years, and I had sent money twice specifically earmarked for that repair, which had not happened. Gerald had mentioned needing to find someone to do the work, so I had sent the money. But the money had gone into the general household account, as it always did, and the porch had not been repaired. Now Darren had offered to spend a weekend fixing it himself, and Renata was calling me not to explain where the money I had sent had gone, but to tell me how wonderful it was that Darren was stepping up. I said, "That is great, Mom." I did not say, "That is great, and also I sent you $400 specifically for that porch repair 14 months ago." I did not say that because I knew how the conversation would go. Renata would get flustered. She would say she thought that money had gone to the heating bill. She would be sorry and confused, and the whole thing would become about managing her distress rather than acknowledging what had actually happened. So I said, "That is great, Mom," and I hung up, and I made a note in the small notebook where I had started keeping a record of what I sent and what it was for. The second thing was at Christmas that same year. Gerald had been having a hard few months with his health, and the visit felt heavier than usual. After dinner, while Renata was in the kitchen, Gerald pulled me aside and said he wanted to talk to me about the house. I thought he was going to say something about the finances, maybe ask if the timeline I had mentioned once, carefully and vaguely, was still realistic. Instead, he told me that he and Renata had been talking and they wanted to make sure the house stayed in the family, and that they had been thinking about adding Darren's name to the deed. They wanted both children on the deed, he said, because that was the fair thing. Both children would inherit equally. I sat with that for a moment, then I asked carefully whether both children had contributed equally to maintaining the house. Gerald looked uncomfortable. He said that was not how inheritance worked. He said it was about family, not about transactions. I said I understood. I drove home the next day and I sat in my apartment for a very long time and I wrote in my notebook, and I thought about the word practical and about the word fair and about how differently those words had operated in my family's vocabulary depending on which child they were being applied to. I did not stop sending money. I know that sounds like it should have been an obvious moment to stop, but I was very close by then. The balance on the mortgage had dropped significantly. I had been making large lump sum payments in addition to my regular contributions for the past 2 years. I could see the finish line, and I had told myself for 19 years that the point was not the recognition. The point was the goal. The point was that my parents would never have to worry about losing that house. That was what I had promised myself when I was 19, sitting at that kitchen table with my mother, looking at the numbers. I was going to keep that promise. But I made one change. I called the mortgage servicer directly and set up a communication preference that sent payment confirmations to an email address only I controlled. I wanted a clean, unambiguous record of every payment I had made. I did not know exactly what I was preparing for. I just knew that the notebook was not enough and that paper trails are the language families understand when every other kind of language has stopped being reliable. The third thing happened 11 months before I made the final payment. Darren called me, which he almost never did unprompted. He was cheerful on the phone in the way he could be when he wanted something, that warm, slightly too casual energy that I had learned to read as a preamble. He said he had been thinking about Mom and Dad and the house and how much it would mean to them to know it was secure. And he said he had talked to a financial advisor and he thought maybe the family should put together a plan to pay off the remaining mortgage. He said he had been crunching some numbers and he thought if he and I both contributed a lump sum, we could get it done within the year. He wanted to know what I thought. I was quiet for a moment, then I asked how much he had been thinking of contributing. He threw out a number, $15,000. He said he could pull that together within a few months if he really committed. He said if I could match that or maybe put in a little more since I was in a better financial position, we could really make a dent. I said, "Darren, how much do you think is still owed on the mortgage?" He said he was not sure exactly, maybe around $90,000 or so. He thought Mom had mentioned something like that. I said the balance was closer to $68,000 at that point, and that I had been making lump sum payments on top of my regular monthly contributions for years, and that I was planning to pay it off entirely within the next 12 months. There was a pause. Then he said, "Wow, I did not know that." I said, "No, you did not." He said, "Well, maybe we could do it together then, like a family thing." I said I had been doing it as a family thing for 19 years. He said there was no need to make it sound like a competition. I said I was not competing with anyone, I was just making sure he had accurate information. He did not call me again for almost 4 months after that conversation. I made the final payment on a Tuesday morning in October. The mortgage was paid in full. The total amount I had contributed over 19 years, between monthly support, lump sum payments, and earmarked repair funds, came to just over $274,000. When the payoff confirmation came through, I sat at my folding table with my cold rice and my hoodie, and I looked at that number and I felt something I could not quite name. It was not happiness exactly. It was more like the feeling of putting down something very heavy that you have been carrying for so long your hands have forgotten what it feels like to hold nothing. I called my mother. She did not pick up. I left a voicemail saying I needed to talk to her about something important and I would be driving up on Saturday. I had already ordered a certified copy of the payoff letter and the mortgage release documents from the servicer, which would take a few days to arrive. I wanted to bring them in person. I wanted to stand in that house and hand those documents to my parents and say, "It is done, it is yours, free and clear." I wanted to see their faces. I had been imagining that moment for years. Renata called back that evening. She sounded warm, a little distracted. She said Saturday was fine, that she would make dinner. She asked if I was doing okay, how was work, how was Ferris. I said everyone was fine. She said it would be nice to have the family together. I did not ask what she meant by that. I should have asked. I drove up Saturday morning, 4 hours, which I had made hundreds of times over the years, so I did it on autopilot, stopping once for gas and coffee. I had my folder on the passenger seat, the payoff letter, the mortgage release confirmation, the printout from the servicer showing the full payoff amount and date, and a summary I had written up of the total contributions I had made over the years in case anyone wanted to understand the full picture. I had the bottle of sparkling water on the floor of the passenger side. I had bought it at a nice grocery store the week before because I wanted the moment to feel like something worth celebrating, even if the celebration was small, even if it was just my parents and me at the kitchen table with a sparkling water and a stack of documents. When I pulled into the driveway, Darren's car was there. I had not known Darren was coming. When I got to the front door and put my key in the lock, the key did not turn. I tried it twice. I stepped back and looked at the lock. It was a different lock. New hardware, newer style. I knocked. I waited. I could see movement through the front window, a curtain shifting. I knocked again. Darren opened the door. He was wearing a button-down shirt and he looked like he had been expecting me, not in a warm way. In the way someone looks when they have prepared for a conversation they are not looking forward to. He said, "Hey, Ackles, come in." I walked in. The house looked different in small ways. There were new throw pillows on the couch. The kitchen had been reorganized. The back porch, I could see through the glass door, had new flooring. My parents were both in the living room. Gerald was in his armchair the way he usually was, slower now, more settled. Renata was on the couch. There was a man I did not recognize sitting in the chair near the window. Darren introduced him as Craig, a friend who had helped with some of the renovation work on the house. I stood in the middle of the room with my folder and my sparkling water and I said, "What is going on?" Renata said, "We just wanted the family together, honey." I looked at Darren. I said, "Why is the lock changed?" He said the old locks were worn out and he had replaced them while he was doing the porch and the kitchen. I said, "And when were you going to give me a key?" He looked at me for a moment and said, "We can definitely get you one made." I sat down. Renata offered me something to drink. I set the folder on the coffee table. I said I drove up here because I have something important to share. I paid off the mortgage. It is done. The house is fully paid off as of Tuesday. I have the documents right here. There was a silence. Then Gerald said, "We know." And I said, "You know." Gerald said Darren had talked to the servicer and confirmed the payoff earlier that week. I looked at Darren. He had his hands clasped in front of him, very still, the way he got when he was managing a room. I said, "You contacted the mortgage servicer?" He said he had wanted to confirm the details so the family could plan next steps. I asked what next steps meant. He said that now that the house was paid off, there were some things the family needed to discuss about ownership and going forward. I said the ownership was simple: Mom and Dad own the house. He said the family had been talking and they thought it made sense to formalize things, add names to the deed, create clarity for when the time came for estate planning. I said Gerald had mentioned this to me at Christmas 2 years ago and I had not agreed to it then. Darren said this was not about whether I agreed, this was about what was fair for the family. I said fair. I heard that word and I felt something very specific. It was not anger yet, not the hot kind. It was more like a door in my chest opening onto something I had been keeping closed for a very long time. I picked up my folder. I took out the printout from the servicer. I laid it on the coffee table so everyone could see it. It showed the total payoff amount, $274,112, and the date of final payment. I said, I want everyone in this room to understand what happened before we talk about what is fair. Renata started to say something soft and redirecting. I said, Mom, please let me finish. She stopped. I said, I have been contributing to this house since I was 19 years old. I have sent money every single month for 19 years. I have made additional lump sum payments in the last several years to bring the balance down faster. The house is paid off because of those contributions. I have documentation of every payment, every single one. Darren looked at Craig, the man by the window who had not moved or spoken since I sat down. I noticed that Craig had a small notepad on his knee. I noticed that Craig was not exactly a friend helping with renovations. I said, Who is Craig? Darren said Craig was someone he had consulted about estate planning. I said, You brought an estate planner to this conversation without telling me? Renata said, Honey, we just wanted to have a family conversation. Gerald was quiet. I looked at my father for a long moment. Gerald had always been the one who drove the big decisions in the family. But he was older now and slower, and the way he was sitting in his chair did not look like a man driving decisions. It looked like a man who had been positioned. I closed the folder. I picked up the sparkling water. I stood up. I said, I'm going to be very clear about what is happening right now. I paid off this house. I have documentation proving every dollar I contributed. If there is an estate planning conversation to be had, it needs to happen with a lawyer, not in this living room with someone Darren brought without telling me. And it needs to happen with full transparency about who paid for what. I am going to go sit in my car for 20 minutes, and when I come back in, I would like to talk to my parents alone. Darren said I was being dramatic. I said I was being clear. I walked out, sat in my car, and I called my friend Petra. Petra has been my closest friend for 12 years. She is a paralegal who has seen enough family property disputes to fill several volumes. I told her everything in about 4 minutes. She said, Ackles, listen to me very carefully. Do not sign anything today. Do not agree to any deed changes today. Do not let anyone take that folder out of your hands. Get the full payoff letter and the mortgage release in your name on record with a property attorney before anyone does anything with that deed. I said the payoff letter showed the account holder as Gerald and Renata, not me. She said that was fine. The payoff record would still show the funds came from an external source and that source could be documented. She said you need a real estate attorney this week, not next month, this week. I said okay. She said, and Ackles, stop being the one who keeps the peace. There is no peace left to keep. When I went back in, Craig was gone. That was something. Renata was in the kitchen. Gerald was still in his chair. Darren was on the couch and he had the posture of someone recalibrating. I sat down across from him. I looked at my father. I said, Did you know what was happening today before I got here? Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Darren thought it would be good to have a plan ready. I said, a plan for what? Gerald said, for the house, for going forward, for fairness. I said, Dad, do you understand how much money I sent to keep this house over the last 19 years? He looked at me. There was something in his face that I had not seen often, which was discomfort, not the irritated kind. The kind that comes when a person has known something was not right for a long time and has successfully avoided looking directly at it until someone puts it in front of them. He said, Your mother and I are very grateful, Ackles. We always have been. I said, I'm not asking for gratitude. I'm asking whether you understood what the numbers looked like. He said, maybe we did not always see the full picture. I said, I would like you to see it now. I opened the folder. I went through the document, not the summary version, the full version, the one with dates and amounts and the cumulative total at the bottom. I had printed it in large enough font that Gerald could read it without leaning in. He was quiet for a long time while he looked at it. Renata had come back from the kitchen and was standing near the doorway. She did not say anything. Darren was watching me from the couch with an expression I could not fully read. Gerald put the document down. He said, Ackles. His voice was different, quieter. He said, I did not know it was this much. I said, I know you did not, and that is part of what I need to say today. I am not angry at you, Dad. I am telling you this because the conversation about this deed in this house needs to start from the truth. And the truth is this document, not whatever Craig came here to present. This. Darren said that he had not been trying to exclude me, that he had only been trying to plan ahead, that estate planning was what responsible people did. I said, Darren, you changed the locks on a house I paid for without giving me a key. You contacted the mortgage servicer to confirm a payoff you knew nothing about 3 days after it happened. You brought an estate planner to a Saturday afternoon family visit without telling me he was coming. Those are not the actions of someone planning ahead. Those are the actions of someone who decided something before I walked in the door. Darren said that was not fair. I said, and there is that word again. Renata sat down next to Gerald. She was rubbing her hands together the way she did when she was upset. She said, "I want everyone to calm down." I said, "Mom, I am calm. I have been calm this whole conversation. I just need you and Dad to understand what I am telling you before anyone moves forward with anything involving that deed." Renata said she was sure Darren had good intentions. I said, "His intentions are not the issue. The record is the issue." I pulled out one more document. It was a letter I had written the night before and printed out, brief and specific, stating that I had made contributions totaling $274,112 toward the mortgage of the property at their address, that I had documentation supporting these contributions in full, and that I was requesting that no changes be made to the deed or estate documents related to the property without my direct participation and legal review. I had 2 copies. I gave one to Gerald and one to Renata. I kept one for myself. Darren said, "You prepared a letter." I said, "I prepared documentation. I'm a logistics professional. I document things." He stared at me. I looked back at him. Then I picked up my folder, picked up my sparkling water, which I still had not opened, and I said, "I'm going to go find a hotel nearby for tonight because I still have some things I want to talk to Mom and Dad about this weekend. But I'm not going to do that in this room with this energy. When you have all had a chance to look at those documents, call me." I walked out. I got in my car. I drove 2 miles to a Hampton Inn and I sat in the parking lot for a while. Then I opened the sparkling water. It was warm by then and it fizzed too hard when I twisted the cap and some of it spilled on my jeans. I drank it anyway. The next morning, Gerald called me. His voice sounded tired in a way that was different from the tired I usually heard from him. He asked if I would come back to the house. He said Renata had been up most of the night and he needed to talk to me. I asked if Darren would be there. He said no. I drove back. When I walked in, the house felt quieter. It was just Gerald and Renata. Renata had made breakfast, eggs and toast, the kind of meal she made when she did not know what else to do. Gerald was at the kitchen table with my documents in front of him, not the ones I had given him. He had gone through the kitchen drawer I could see where they kept old financial papers and pulled out years of statements and receipts in the old mortgage booklets. He had been trying to reconstruct the timeline on his own. He looked up when I sat down. He said, "I have been sitting here since 5 o'clock this morning." I said, "I know." He said, "Ackles, I owe you an apology." I did not say anything. I let him talk. He said, "I always knew you were helping. I always knew you were giving a lot. But I let myself believe it was more modest than it was because it was easier not to do the math. I did not push Darren to help because it was easier not to push. And I think your mother and I let a certain understanding develop in this family that was not fair to you." His voice cracked a little on that last sentence and he stopped. Renata was standing at the counter with her back to us and I could see her shoulders shaking slightly. I sat with the apology for a moment. I have spent a lot of time thinking about how I would feel when someone in my family finally said those words to me if they ever said them. The truth is that I did not feel the wave of relief I had imagined. I felt something more complicated. Sadness partly something softer, the recognition of my father as a person who had made choices he now understood differently, which was more human than the flat story of a family that simply did not care. He had cared, he had just been too comfortable with the arrangement to examine it. That is its own kind of failing, but it is a human one. I said, "Dad, I accept your apology. But I need you to understand that accepting it does not mean I am going to walk back into the same arrangement." I said the house was paid off and that was the end of my financial contribution to it. I said if they needed help in the future they could come to me directly and I would consider it case by case. But I was not going to be the automatic resource anymore. I was not going to quietly absorb costs that went undocumented and unacknowledged. And I was not going to agree to any deed or estate arrangements that did not honestly reflect the history of who had actually built the thing we were all now talking about protecting. Gerald nodded. He said he would not sign anything without involving me. He said that was a promise. I believed him. I believed it partly because of the way he said it, quietly and without performance, and partly because my father, whatever his failings, had never been someone who made promises and then broke them deliberately. His failures were always more passive than that. The harder conversation happened when Darren showed up an hour later. He came without calling first, which told me he had expected me to still be at the hotel and had planned to arrive after I was gone. When he walked into the kitchen and found me sitting at the table with both parents, his energy shifted. He got very still in the way he had the day before, controlled. Gerald told Darren to sit down. Darren sat. Gerald said he had been going through the paperwork and that he wanted to say, in front of everyone, that he understood now the scope of what Ackles had contributed to the house, and that it needed to be part of any conversation going forward. Darren looked at me. His expression was hard to read. He said, "I never said it should not be part of the conversation." I said, "Darren, you brought an estate planner to a Saturday family visit and changed the locks on the house and did not give me a key. That is not a conversation, that is a conclusion presented after the fact." He said he had changed the locks because the old hardware was genuinely worn out and he had simply not gotten around to cutting me a key yet. I said, and the estate planner? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, look, I know how this looks. I said, it looks like you saw an opportunity. He said that was not fair. And I said, Darren, what does fair mean to you in this context? Because in this family, fair has always meant you get the benefit of the doubt and I get the bill. He looked away. That was the first time I had ever said anything that direct to him, not in anger, just as a clear statement of the pattern. He did not have an answer for it. He sat there looking at the window. Renata said she had not understood how much pressure I had been under all these years. She said she thought I was okay. She said I never complained. I said, Mom, I never complained because I was handling it. But handling something quietly does not mean the weight was not there. She said she was sorry. I said I believed her. I told both of them what I had told Gerald earlier, that I was not going to be the invisible financial resource anymore, that I would maintain a relationship with the family, but it was going to be a different kind of relationship than it had been. One that was honest and equal and did not assume that I could absorb whatever was needed without acknowledgement or discussion. They both nodded. Then I looked at Darren. I said, I want to have a real conversation with you at some point about what this family dynamic was like from my side. Not today, but at some point. I think you and I have never actually talked about it. He said he was open to that. His voice was quieter than it had been. I do not know if he meant it entirely, but it was more than I had expected him to say. I stayed for the rest of the weekend. I had dinner with my parents both evenings. The dinners were quieter than usual, but not cold. There was a kind of recalibration happening. The air in the house felt different, more honest. Gerald showed me the back porch after dinner on Sunday, the new wood Darren had laid, and I told him it looked good because it did. People can do good work and still be complicated. I have always believed that. On Sunday afternoon, before I drove home, I asked Gerald if he had talked to Darren about the deed. He said he had. He said they would not be adding anyone's name without a proper legal process and without my participation. He said he had also spoken to the estate planner Darren had brought and told him his services were not needed. I asked how Darren had responded to that. Gerald said he was not happy, but he understood. I said okay. I drove home in a quieter state of mind than I had driven up. Not resolved exactly. These things do not resolve cleanly, and anyone who tells you otherwise has not lived in a complicated family. But something had shifted. A door that had been held shut for 19 years by everyone's agreement not to open it had been opened, and the air on the other side was harder to breathe than I had expected, but it was real air. For the first time in a very long time, the situation was honest. There are a few things that happened in the weeks after that Saturday that I want to share because they matter to how this story ends. The first is that I found a real estate attorney through Petra's recommendation, and I had a full consultation about the property. The attorney confirmed that because my contributions had been made to the mortgage account and not in exchange for any documented ownership stake, I did not have an automatic legal claim to the property. However, she said that the payment history was clear and well documented, and that if the family chose to, they could recognize my contribution through an updated estate arrangement that reflected the financial reality. She said this was not uncommon in family situations and that there were several clean legal structures for handling it. I took notes. I did not make any demands of my parents at that point. I simply wanted to understand my position. The second thing is that Gerald and Renata, on their own initiative, contacted a different estate attorney without Darren's involvement. They called me to tell me they had done this and to ask if I would come to a meeting with that attorney. I said yes. The meeting happened about 6 weeks after that Saturday. I drove up and we sat with the attorney. And we went through the property and its history and what both parents wanted for it. Gerald spoke more than I had ever heard him speak in a practical conversation. He was clear. He said he wanted the estate to reflect that Ackles had carried more than was fair and that fairness in inheritance should account for that. The outcome of that process was a revised estate arrangement that I am not going to detail in full, because some things are private and this particular piece is between my family and the relevant attorneys. But what I will tell you is that it reflected the truth. For the first time in my family's history, the legal documents reflected what had actually happened, not the comfortable fiction that everyone had been maintaining. The third thing is about Darren. He called me about 3 weeks after that Saturday. He was quieter on the phone than usual. He said he had been thinking about what I had said about the family dynamic about fair. He said he did not think he had ever deliberately tried to take advantage of me, and I said I believed that because I did. I said the problem was never that he was deliberately cruel. The problem was that he had benefited from an arrangement he never examined. He said that was fair. I noticed he said it without irony. I told him I did not need an apology, not a big one, not a performance. What I needed was for him to understand the real history. He said he thought he was starting to. We have not gone back to how things were before. I do not think that version of before was ever really okay, so going back to it would not be progress. But but we talk now in a way that has more honesty in it. I do not carry his feelings for him the way I used to. I do not soften what I say so he can stay comfortable. I just say what is true in plain language and let him figure out how to sit with it. That is a different relationship. It is not perfect, but it is real. I went back to my parents' house 2 months after that Saturday for a visit that was just a visit, no documents, no agendas. Renata had cooked a large meal. Gerald was in his chair, but he was more alert than he had been, more engaged, less settled into himself. Darren was not there. Renata said he had another commitment. I said okay, and I meant it. After dinner, Gerald asked me to sit on the back porch with him for a while. The new wood was good, solid underfoot, clean, better than the old planks that had been slowly warping for years. We sat out there in the cooling evening and Gerald said, "I want to ask you something." I said, "Go ahead." He said, "Was it worth it?" He meant the 19 years. He meant the money and the sacrifice and the weight I had carried. I thought about it for a while before I answered. I said I think it was worth it when I was doing it for the right reason, which was that I did not want you and Mom to lose the house. That was always the real reason, not to earn credit, not to be thanked, not to put anyone in debt to me. I did it because I loved you and because I had decided the house was worth saving. I said what I needed to change was not what I had done. It was the part where I let it go unacknowledged for so long that it became invisible. The sacrifice was not the mistake, the silence around it was. He nodded. He said he understood that now. I believed him. I drove home that evening in a different kind of quiet than the ones I had driven home in before. Not the old tired quiet. Not the quiet of someone who had absorbed a hurt and was managing it alone on a long dark road. A cleaner quiet. The kind that comes when something true has finally been said out loud and the world has not ended from hearing it. When the person you were afraid to disappoint has looked you in the eye and said, "I see you," and you have looked back and said, "Good, it is about time." I still have my apartment with the good morning light. I still have Ferris, who met me at the door that evening with the slightly irritated energy of a cat who has been left alone too long and wants you to know about it. I still work in logistics, which I genuinely enjoy. I still cook at home more than I eat out, though now it is a choice rather than a constraint. What I do not have anymore is the constant low background weight of an obligation that existed in the space between what was said and what was true. I do not have the particular exhaustion that comes from being the reliable one in a way that was never named or honored. I do not have the feeling of driving home from my parents' house and wondering why I felt lonelier in that house than I did alone. What I have instead is a clear understanding of what I will give, what I will not give, and what it means when someone receives my help and acts as though it was just the natural condition of things. That understanding cost me 19 years and $274,000 to earn, and I do not recommend the tuition rate. But I would rather be here in this clarity than still be in the arrangement, quiet and invisible and certain that if I just gave a little more, eventually I would feel like I mattered. I mattered, I always did, I just needed to say it out loud. Here is what I know now that I did not know when I was 19, sitting at that kitchen table, looking at the numbers and telling myself I could handle it. I know that the people who love you can still take more than is fair. I know that sacrifice without visibility does not create gratitude, it creates expectation. I know that when you are the one who always handles things, the people around you do not necessarily become grateful, they become accustomed. And I know that the moment you stop being quiet about what is true is not the moment your family falls apart. It is the moment the family is finally forced to stand on honest ground, which is the only ground worth standing on. I also know this. A house is a practical thing, wood and plaster and a mortgage number. But what it holds inside, the years, the meals, the conflicts, the silences, the agreements never spoken, the weight carried by the person who never asked for the credit because they had already decided the goal was worth it, that is not practical. That is a whole life. That is the thing that I showed up on that porch with, in a folder and a bottle of sparkling water, and that nobody on the other side of that new lock had thought to make room for. They made room in the end. That matters. Not everyone's story gets that. Mine did. And if you're someone who is carrying something like this, something heavy and uncredited and quietly enormous, I want you to know that you are allowed to put it down. You are allowed to tell the truth about what you carried. You are allowed to say, "This is what I did, and it was real, and it matters, and I deserve to be seen for it." You do not have to wait 19 years. You do not have to get to the last dollar before you say it. You can say it now. The truth does not need a payoff letter to make it official. It just needs you to be willing to speak it. That Saturday, when I walked back into my parents' house after sitting in my car with the warm sparkling water and the call with Petra, I was still carrying the folder. I was still the same person who had driven 4 hours in a hoodie, but I walked back in differently. I walked in like someone who already knew what was in the folder and did not need anyone else to confirm it. I walked in like someone who had stopped needing the room's permission to take up space in it. The locks had been changed, that was true, but I had the documents. And the documents told the real story, not the family story, the polished version where everyone did their fair share and no one was asked to carry more than anyone else. The real story with the dates and the amounts and the long, long list of months that added up to something no one had ever said out loud. When you have the real story written down, clearly in your own hand in black and white with the confirmation numbers to back it up, the people who thought they could rewrite it for their own comfort find themselves with a much harder task than they expected. That is what happened. That is Ackles' story. That is the truth. Before you go, I want to ask you something that I have been sitting with since the day I drove home from that visit. If the people in your life received your sacrifice as though it were simply owed to them, how long did it take you to realize that silence was not the same as peace? And when you finally decided to speak the truth, who was the first person you said it to? Leave a comment below and tell Ackles your story, because sometimes the most powerful thing one person can do is let another person know they are not carrying this weight alone.